so much. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to meet you all and to be here today. I'll start right away with my topic. It's about Protestant missionaries, especially Americans, in the late Ottoman Empire and their activities among the so-called heterodox Muslim communities outside the purview of Sunni Islam. And as you know, the Nusayris, better known as the Alawis or Alawites, are an Arabic-speaking members of an esoteric sect with roots in Shia Islam in South Turkey, but especially in Syria, who have kept their identity secret by living in seclusion, owing to fear of persecution by the Sunni orthodoxy. Knowledge of the Nusayris and similar non-Sunni heterodox groups in modern times began with Western travelers, Orientalists, and missionaries from the early 19th century onwards. These secret sects were studied for learned purposes, to bring them into the fold of Christianity, but also to find ways how to exploit them against the Ottomans politically. In the Ottoman Empire, real interest in the Nusayris started during the reign of Sultan Abdul Hamid II, who reigned from 1876 to 1909. The fear of infiltration of the Muslims by foreigners, especially American Protestant missionaries, pressed the Sultan to endorse a more orthodox form of the official Hanafi Sunni legal school. The Ottoman Empire was a conglomerate of officially recognized religions, say Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but also officially not recognized sects within these religions, especially within Islam. These sects not only concealed their beliefs, but sometimes did not accept the official religion or mainstream beliefs. Even though non-Sunni religious minorities within Islam were not regarded as non-Muslims, they were labeled heretical and largely ostracized by the Sunni clergy and people. Within the Muslim community, such heretics, as to use the Ottoman label for them, were the Shi'is, Alevis, like the Kurdish and Turkish Alevis in Anatolia, the Yazidis, and the Nusayris. These were creeds seen as deviant of the Caliphal Hanafi Sunni dynasty and had no official status as autonomous religious communities, as millets. In the first 3 decades of the 19th century, in fact, we see efforts of the Ottoman administration to label the Nusayris alongside Yazidis and the Shias of Lebanon as political scapegoats. They were linked with rebellions incited by local governors in Syria or accused of collaboration with the Greek, who during their nationalist revolt in the 1820s supposedly tried to unite heterodox sects against the Muslims, against the Ottomans. At the same time, governors in Syria who were hostile toward each other showed leniency towards the Nusayris and similar groups and proposed their pacification in an attempt to win them as allies. So largely the ill treatment of the Nusayris by the Ottomans and similar heterodox communities by the majority of the population and the authorities had aroused the compassion of American Protestant missionaries who tried to win or harvest their souls. When the first missionaries were sent to the Ottoman Empire around 1819, their chosen aim was to convert all the people to Protestant Christianity. The American Protestant missionary movement was commenced for religious purposes first, that is to say, the evangelization of the world. This was done and inspired by the teachings of their religion and by their patriotism for their young country, and this in turn led to a belief that American ideals should be spread throughout the world and was at the basis of the Second Awakening, the revivalist or millenarian religious movement that launched the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, ABCFM in Boston, which organized and financed all missions until 1870 in the Ottoman Empire. Later, the Reformed Presbyterian Church of North America took over the Syria mission. They stressed both a return to religion and the glorification of American democracy and values all over the world. However, the first missionaries set out for their journey believing that, quote, While conversions might be made elsewhere in the world, only in Palestine would they have an immediate and millennial impact. Only there would the Protestants longing to reunite with their spiritual forebears, the Jews, converge with the yearning for the Messiah's reappearance. The missionaries were not unconscious of Islam as the dominant religion in the Ottoman Empire, and that a substantial number of non-Protestant Christian communities also lived there. Consequently, the ABCFM's representatives also hoped to convert those native Christians, the Muslims, and the other minorities, especially the Jews in the beginning. Owing to the lack of a formal relationship between the USA and the Ottoman Empire at the beginning of the 19th century, the missionaries set out without knowing one important factor. Proselytizing to Muslims was illegal in the Ottoman Empire. Upon learning about this fact, the missionaries commented thus, I quote again, "The nature of the Turkish government may be considered unfavorable to Christian missionaries. Once Mohammedans, so the Muslims, were engaged in disseminating their religion by the sword, then conversion or death was the only alternative offered to those under their power. Now death is the penalty of apostasy from their religion." However, opposing this view of the missionaries, the mere existence of so many minorities had been living peacefully for centuries under Ottoman rule should have showed the missionaries that their statement about conversion under Islam could not hold true. But this was less problematic than the fact that any Muslim who converted would be executed by the state. Despite this disturbing situation, the missionaries remained optimistic about their new field of labor and understood that they only would have to adjust to the new situation and change their priorities. All who were not Muslim were allowed to change their religion as they pleased. The Protestants understood that they could be well protected on foreign soil than by the British consuls throughout the empire, and at the same time they feared Ottoman law significantly enough not to work against the ban on preaching Muslims. Thus their mission would be changed because of this prohibition, and their target population became the non-Protestant Christians living in Greater Syria. At first, their religious goals were expressed, like the religious goals of the Protestant missionaries, were expressed in apocalyptic terms, such as that the gospel would, quote, hasten the decline and fall of the bloody crescent of Muhammad, the forces of evil occasionally unite for opposing missionary efforts, but this opposition would only be a prelude to the battle of the great day, when Islam would be overthrown. As early as the late 1820s, those missionaries targeted Syria, including Palestine, as the land of the Bible that they reclaimed, and gave attention to socially marginalized heterodox Muslim minorities, such as the Shiis, the Druze, and the Nusayris, who were not accepted by the Sunni majority. These minorities, who lived in the regions stretching from Antioch to Palestine, a hiding place of schism and heresy, though nominal Muslims, quote, have scarcely any religion at all. When the day comes, as it certainly will before long, that Mohammedans shall be converted to God. They will furnish a most interesting field of labor, quote end. By establishing the necessary missions among the Muslims, especially the Druze and the pagan Nusayris, God would hasten the downfall of Satan's empire throughout this land and the whole world. That's what the Protestant missionaries thought. For them, the Nusayris were, again to quote, a wretched and degraded people for whom no evangelical exertions have been made. They were constantly oppressed by an unjust Ottoman government. What the Nusayris needed was the word of life. They were appropriate objects of Christian benevolence because, quote, the religion, whatever it be, exerted no good influence upon them. It is in fact no better than paganism. Some of their ideas and many of their practices are truly abominable. Of course, the ignorance and wretchedness of the people is very great. The way of peace they have not known. Quote end. Initially, the missionaries did not have much knowledge about the Nusayris, in particular about their beliefs, except rumors. As hospitable and sociable they found the Nusayris, when it came to talk about their faith, they were, quote, much more willing to sip coffee and smoke tobacco than to impart information about their country or their faith. The Nusayris had hermetically sealed their mouths due to fear of being hated and watched by the Sunni Muslims. Some basic information about the Nusayris could be gathered. That they were numbering in 1841, for example, about 200,000, were divided into different sects, did not have places or times for prayers, had their own religious books, believed in the transmigration of the soul, and that they were illiterate and the like. The Nusayris were then the chief attraction for a mission in Syria and would probably prove a very accessible people. Because of the above mentioned and other reasons, again, quote, for generations they have seen no strangers or foreigners among them, except insulting enemies and outrageous oppressors. This has given them a distrust and certain dislike of all strangers. Such a numerous, widespread, semi-barbarous and wholly neglected population presents strong claims upon our Christian compassion. Quote end. The missionaries felt proximity to the Nusayris not only because of compassion, but also due to religious reasons. Supposedly, this community did not practice Islam, but seemed to be nearer to Eastern Christianity. When American Protestant missionaries first set foot on Ottoman soil, the two most fanatical, bitter, and zealous opponents of Protestantism were Islam and Eastern Christianity. The original aim was to purify the degenerate nominal Christian sects, revive their spiritual faith, and make them preach the pure gospel. Thus, becoming true Christians and being united in one evangelical church, they would exert a vigorous influence on the Muslims with their righteousness. For this purpose, the Nusayris were sometimes seen as lost Christians and included among Christian denominations. The missionaries were convinced that the Nusayris were receptive to the gospel, willing to receive missionaries, and send their children to Protestant schools. They needed only to be convinced that the missionaries were, quote, sincere friends and had come not to rob, oppress, or abuse them, but to befriend them and do them good, quote end. Their, again, quote, ignorance and wretchedness, their utter destitution of religion, their isolation from all the rest of the world, quote end, was regarded as important factors to open missions among them. To bring these miserable outcast heathen without God and having no hope, another missionary view about them, into the fold of Jesus was urgent and overdue. All over the ABC-FM used the word pagan and heathen for groups that seemed not to be following Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Missionary schools were eventually established to educate those who were destitute of the knowledge of Christianity. This also included the Nusayris. Especially children needed to be taught the Bible. The main purpose of founding schools stemmed from the belief that by teaching the local youth, regardless of their religion, to be literate, they would be able to choose only one true religion, that is Protestant Christianity. But only a few Nusayris converted to Protestantism. By the year 1868, American missionaries admitted that the Nusayris have not been reached in any considerable numbers by the gospel. Though them had become enlightened through the existence of a Protestant community near them. The missionaries still hoped that before long, the evangelists will have penetrated that section of the country and that they shall begin to set the foundations of Islam among those who are less fanatically attached to all its precepts. The same hope prevailed later in 1911 when the missionary James Balfe wrote that the schools they established in Nusayri villages did not yield much fruit, but that still a few Nusayris converted to Protestantism, who have received and lived the truth despite the withering, blighting influence of heathenism with which they have been surrounded. Efficient work had been aggravated by the persistent and determined opposition of the Ottoman government over the 2 previous decades. And the outcome was that the darkness of ignorance, again to quote again, ignorance, superstition, and paganism still broods like a deadly miasma over the land, paralyzing the hearts and souls of men and casting over them the lethargy of spiritual death. Quote end. On the whole, the missionary conversion project failed, not only in Syria. Schools of the Syrian mission were closed down in the late 1880s until the early 1890s, at the height of Sultan Abdul Hamid's power. Mehmed Zia Bey, the local governor of Latakia, barred Protestant missionary work on behalf of the Ottoman government. Writing in November 1891, a missionary in Latakia stated that the governor was doing all he can to hinder our work, seizing mission property, turning our teachers out of doors, and threatening them if they will not leave our employ. Henry Eason of the Reformed Presbyterian Church informed its board and the US State Department that the Ottoman government had illegally restored mission property in Syria to its former Nusayri owners in October 1891, and that the following month other property was also seized and the teachers banned from villages. Mehmed Zia, the governor of Latakia, had told him that since they did not own any building in the villages, they could not open schools. The governor had given orders to the village chiefs that they should not allow missionaries to enter the villages. The missionaries protested the closing of the schools, saying that it is illegal because the Nusayris were pagans and not Muslims. The result has been, reported a missionary later, that a generation has grown up in ignorance. What was injustice to the missionaries was justice to the Nusayris, and deviant or heretical for the Ottomans, the Nusayris were still Muslims. After decades of Ottoman oppression by several governors until the 1880s, efforts were made later that decade to better their condition as part of the centralization policy of Sultan Abdul Hamid II. Ismail Kemal Bey, Governor General of Beirut from 1890 to 92, writes that he was struck by the injustices done to the Nusayris when he was inspecting the hinterland of Latakia and so introduced measures to appease them. The Latakia region was to be a high-profile case for carrying out the Ottomans' benevolent reforms. The imperial reformation in this period, in fact, was not to bring liberty to subjects, but to tighten the grip on them even more and firmly attach them to the caliphate. In order to prevent missionary work among heterodox sects, Abdul Hamid pursued counter-propaganda through the establishment of Muslim schools and mosques in non-Sunni areas. These were means of a civilizing mission by which heretics should be converted to the Hanafi school, which was at that time inclined to conservative ideas. A policy of reward and punishment, or the carrot or stick method, was applied, whereas sometimes brutal methods and systematic repression were used to correct the ignorance and heresy of these people. Often education and persuasion were applied as a defensive weapon against the imminent threat to the unity and integrity of the Ottoman Empire posed by these marginal, unorthodox communities. The policy of correction of beliefs was the ideological background of the Ottoman Sunni civilizing mission, and accordingly the conversion strategies of the administration of Sultan Abdul Hamid. Earlier, Sultan Mahmud II applied this concept of correction of beliefs in the context of the persecution of the Bektashi Sufi order during the first half of the 19th century. Abdul Hamid II applied it to non-Sunni Islamic sects, such as the Turkish and Kurdish Alevis in Anatolia, the Nusayris in Syria, the Shi'is in Iraq, and the Yazidis in Eastern Anatolia. The motivation of the Hamidian regime was to civilize these non-conformist groups and bring them into the Sunni fold by fine-tuning their beliefs. The measure the state took during the reign of Abdul Hamid II in response to the missionary schools was a systematized policy based on a new ideological approach. The policy of pan-Islam or unity of Islam, which was introduced as the official ideology of the state during that time, was initiated to strengthen the loyalty of the Muslim subjects to the state. This policy aimed to strengthen the bond between the state and heterodox Muslim groups, which were outside Sunni Islam and were targeted by Western Christian missionaries. However, according to this pan-Islam, the relationship that could be established with these groups could be made by conversion to Islam or by adopting the official ideology of the state through correction of beliefs. The new relations that were to be established with those outside Sunni Islam and with the Nusayris would be made from this ideological perspective. What was distinctive of the period of Abdul Hamid, as opposed to the earlier efforts of Mahmud II, is that the whole policy of reforms was subordinated to a more strongly felt need for unity among the Muslim population of the empire. With the rule of Abdul Hamid II, the concept correction of beliefs was applied differently once again, this time in the context of a civilizing mission, again for the centralization of the Sultan's powers. This was also intended to protect various non-Sunni groups from the conversion campaigns of Christian missionaries. Even if Abdul Hamid's strategy of incorporating heretical groups did not really win them over, the government's policy successfully isolated them from the American Protestant missionaries. Protestantism became a main ideological enemy for the Ottomans because it regarded Islam as the arch-enemy and challenged traditional Muslim cohesion and power. As it appears, sometimes groups of Ottoman Shi'is, Nusayris, and Yazidis converted to official Hanafi Sunni Islam willingly, at least based on Ottoman archival documents. These would request that schools and mosques be built in their district, especially that children receive proper education in that schools, teachers, copies of the Quran, books to teach the alphabet, and Islamic catechisms were sent for instruction. The above-mentioned governor of Latakia, Mehmed Zia, warned Istanbul that if one leaves the Nusayris in a state of ignorance, this would only profit the missionaries who, quote, have already gone so far as to pay regular salaries to the Nusayri leaders, quote, end. Therefore, the Sultan should respond to the Nusayris' wish to become Muslims, say Sunnis, and prove to the foreigners that the government is able to take care of them. According to some Alevi writers in the 20th century, several of the religious leaders tried to reform their faith and community during the awakening and renaissance of the Nusayris in the 19th century. The way they followed was to prove that the Nusayris were pious Muslims who adhered to the Islamic rules. So some sheikhs had built mosques in Nusayri villages. They believed that the only cure against the lethargy of their people was knowledge or science. To achieve this, one of the sheikhs met the governor Mehmed Zia. It is said that the latter was convinced to take measures in order to save the Nusayris from ignorance and illiteracy. The said sheikh wrote a letter containing proposals to the Sublime Porte, which the Abbey forwarded. Istanbul was pleased and agreed. The version of this story told by the governor of Latakia was that several religious and secular leaders of the Nusayris approached and told him that in early times they had been pious Muslims, but in the course of time they strayed far from the right path because of ignorance. Now they wanted to awake from the slumber of negligence and see how the matchless Sultan Abdul Hamid had spread sciences, education, and justice in the Ottoman Empire, and so revived the people. The Nusayri leaders were proud of being attached to the Sultan and wanted to return to Hanafi Sunni Islam and benefit from the sciences, education, and the just order. Since they had desired salvation, the governor promised them instruction in the religion of Islam, sciences, and education by carrying out the necessary measures, such as the construction of schools and mosques and providing elementary textbooks about Islamic principles. By the late 1880s, then the Ottoman civilizing mission changed from the stick to the carrot with the moderate approach of Mehmed Ziya Bey, when the jurisdiction of Latakia changed over to Beirut. In order to make effective the authority of the official Hanafi Sunni creed permanently, he let build roads, constructed administrative buildings, provided for educational programs in the northern sub-provinces of Syria, where the majority was Nusayri. Schools and mosques were built in Nusayri towns and villages. However, the schools and mosques were abandoned after the death of Mehmed Ziya. They were used as storage rooms and stables. It is said that mosques had been built in Nusayri areas almost as talismans to ward off the foreign eye. In such cases, Nusayris who had become Sunnis returned to their old beliefs and became apostates. The Ottomans assessed such situations as opportunities for Nusayris to be protected by foreign powers, or in the case of males, to escape military conscription. Still, in the 1890s and later in 1904, we see official Ottoman reports of Nusayris in Antakya, in Antioch, asking for conversion to Islam and for Muslim schools. On the whole, local Sunnis viewed the Nusayri conversions to Islam with suspicion, as they were allowed to hide their beliefs and appear as Muslims when forced by circumstances. So they were using this taqiyya. There are reports of tens of thousands of Nusayris requesting conversion to Islam. The Mufti and local landlords in Antakya, for example, protested, since the Nusayris would have been equal with other Muslims, and local landholders would not make them work like slaves anymore. The central administration refused the protest and accepted the Nusayri conversions in order to reinforce Abdul Hamid's position as caliph of all Muslims. Efforts by well-intentioned Ottoman officials to bring justice, education, and welfare to the Nusayri regions were not successful. Before and after the Young Turk Revolution in 1908, Nusayri leaders in Aleppo in 1892 and Antakya and Latakia in 1908 sent petitions to Istanbul and complained that despite the great numbers of their people, they were not represented in courts and councils. Hostilities or unjust treatment by Sunnis against the Nusayris apparently continued during the Young Turk era, despite the revolution's ideals of freedom and equality. Lastly, it is interesting to note that in the petitions of 1892 and 1909, the Nusayris called themselves the Arab Alawi community, our Alawi Nusayri community, and signed the letters with the Alawi community. This early self-designation as Alawis has, in my opinion, a double importance. Firstly, it seems to confirm the reformation of the Nusayris, launched by some of their religious leaders in the late 19th century, and their attempt to be part of Islam. And secondly, it challenges the discussions that the change of the identity and name from Nusayri to Alawi took place around 1920, in the beginning of the French mandate in Syria. If I may conclude then, the Ottoman attitude towards the Nusayris in the 19th century was in fact ambivalent. Whereas they were officially considered as apostates without a legal status, they were treated as Muslims in administrative details. In the latter part of the 19th century, the Ottoman authorities attempted to integrate them into mainstream Sunni Islam through educative means based on the concept of correction of beliefs. to keep back foreign intervention, and to legitimize the Sultan as the leader of all Muslims. The Nusayris, who are said to have converted to Sunni Islam, did this most likely outwardly and disguised their real beliefs in order to secure legal rights. Nor were they seriously affected by Christian missionaries. Altogether, both the Sunni Ottoman and Protestant missionary attempts of converting the Nusayris failed. The name Alawi became accepted after World War I with the short-lived state of the Alawis, under the French mandate in Syria as an autonomous region and later as one of the federation states of Syria. It is known that the Alawis were made into a dominant sect by the French, who were trying to counter Sunni hegemony in Syria. My findings, especially in my book, indicate that the Alawis were already prepared for this role ultimately by the tension between the Ottomans and the Western powers.